everyone, Christina here. Welcome to day 3 of the holiday card series for 2021. So glad you're here. Today's card is all about the faux dip dye watercolor plus a lot of heat embossing. I'm going to be using a fun stamp set from Concord and Ninth, and we're going to be making it a slimline card as well. Let's get into it.
Before we get to the card for today, I wanted to share with you how I came up with the color palette for today's card. And it's from this free PDF download that Dana Joy and I have put together for you guys, a sort of a Christmas gift for all of you. It is absolutely free and available for download at the link down in the video description or at my blog. Basically, what this is 10 pages with 10 different inspiration pictures and color combos. And then we've taken those color combos and translated them into 8 different brands of ink pads. So you've got Simon, Concord and Ninth, Gina K, My Favorite Things, Pink Fresh Studio, Hero Arts, Altenew, and Tim Holtz Distress. And this one that's on screen right now is the inspiration for today's card, kind of an intense purple to pink to magenta with gold accents. So go ahead and get that download down below. And just so you know, Dana will be joining me next Wednesday for the live stream for day 5. So don't miss out on that either. I'm using the Big on Christmas stamp set from Concord and Ninth. And before I get to the stamping, I'm going to do a bunch of watercoloring. And I'm going to be creating a slimline card. So I've cut down my watercolor piece to 3 inches tall by I think it's still about 9 inches wide. It's too wide for the card, but I wanted to have it larger than the card base so that I could tear off the edge of the watercolor paper. So I've made my card base. This is a slimline card, so it's 3.5 tall by 8.5 wide. And then I have my watercolor paper here. I'm going to place it on top, and then I'm going to tear the one edge so that it's about the same distance all around. So it's about a 1/4 inch short on each edge. So just tore that off. And I'm going to be doing a faux dip dye with watercolor technique today. I believe the first time I ever did this was during a holiday card series video, and I have loved it ever since. It's super dramatic and dark, and it's very impressive, but it's a very easy technique that I think most anyone can do. The watercolor set that I love to use for this is the same one that I've used year after year after year. I think I've ventured out and tried some of this with Winsor and Newton watercolors and things like that, but I constantly come back to this watercolor set. This is the Kuretake Zig Gansai Tambi palette. And I think the reason why I come back to this one is because I tend to do this faux dip dye watercolor technique with a wide flat brush. And these pans of watercolor are nice and big. So it's easy to get that large brush into that pan of watercolor. So the idea behind this technique is that dip dye, when actual dip dye is done, you're taking a paper and you're dipping it into dye. And so the bottom edge that's going into the dye first will have the most color on it. And you dip it into the dye multiple times, and you have the paper go in a little bit less each time so that the color starts to build, and you get these like steps of color going all the way down your paper with the most intense color at the bottom. So I'm mimicking that look by painting it like that. I started with a very, very pale pink, very diluted red shade. And as I start painting toward that other side, the right side, which on my finished card, it's actually turned the other way around. But as I paint toward that edge and I start moving in a little bit shorter, I'm adding a little bit more color into the pool of paint that I'm working with. So I'm adding a little more of that red color and just making the watercolor itself more intense as I move along. I'm also thinking about that color palette that I'm using today, and I want this pink shade, this kind of magenta, to morph into purple and then a really, really dark, intense purple. So as I'm getting this darker and darker and darker, I'm starting to think, okay, at some point, I'm going to need to start adding in a little bit of purple so that I can get that transition. So I'm adding more and more color and I'm drying all of the paint in between each layer. So this is a little bit time consuming and it is easier if you have a heat tool to work with, but you want to make sure that you have each layer completely dry before you move on because you want that harsh edge of where the color begins. So now I'm putting in a little bit of purple. I'm starting to make that transition. So, and then bringing in more and more purple, trying to get that color. I'm going to try to even this out as much as I can and then use my heat tool to speed up the drying process. All right, now I'm going to mix in even more purple. This is quite the quick transition to the purple. So I'm adding more of that purple shade in. And then after this layer is dry, I'm adding even more purple. At some point, I'm going to start adding a little bit of a darker blue because I do want this to kind of morph into a black shade. So I've added a little bit of blue to my color here. And I'm going to do, I think, just a couple more layers here, adding more and more of that blue shade. And then eventually I'm just going to go straight to black and just put that on there. And there's a lot of paint on this watercolor paper. So you want to make sure it's completely dry before you move on because you don't want any of that paint kind of pulling up and, smudging as you move on with the rest of your card. So I'm drying that completely. And then here I have my faux dip dye watercolor piece. I think it looks so neat. I think if I was going to do it over again, I would have a little bit more of a transition between that pink into purple, but even so, I think this looks amazing. So now I'm going to put this into my Misty stamp positioning tool, and I'm going to start using that Concord and Ninth stamp set. I've positioned my gradings on the watercolor paper, and I'm going to use my anti-static powder tool all over this watercolor paper. I'm going to be doing some heat embossing and adding those gold accents like that color combo. And I want to make sure that I don't have gold embossing powder going anywhere where I don't want it. So I inked up my stamps with the Versamark ink. And I'm going to use my Stampin' Bug glider to help me get a really nice impression of these nice, big, and thick stamped letters. I'm going to stamp this twice because I am using watercolor paper. And so sometimes that texture doesn't want to get a complete stamped image. And then I applied some gilded embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. This is a nice gold shade. I'm making sure that I have that embossing powder completely coating all of the letters. And then I'll hit this with my heat tool. Now, because I did stamp the letters twice and I was pressing down quite a bit, the smaller greeting at the top, "May your holidays be," look a little bit blobby, but you can still read it. So I decided to just move on and keep going. So now I'm using the Lots of Stars stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. Now the inspiration to use these stars actually came from the Concord and Ninth stamp set. They have a little star included. And I thought about just stamping that star over and over again, but then I decided I wanted a variety of sizes of stars. So that's when I pulled out the Lots of Stars stamp set from Simon. And I stamped a bunch of these stars all together in one go. I applied some of that same gold embossing powder to all of the stamps. And then I'm going to stamp a larger star as well. So the larger star that I wanted to use, I wanted it to be kind of bleeding off the edge. And so I wanted to stamp it last so that I could turn my piece around and have it in my Misty tool the other direction so that the points of those stars could kind of bleed off the edge. So I'm adding in this very last star here. This is a very simple card to look at. It doesn't have a whole lot going on. It's all about that color. So don't be afraid to spend a lot of time on your watercolor background before you go in with some really simple stamping, because I think the real focal point and star of the show is that background. So I applied that gilded embossing powder and heat set it until it was melted. And then I was very generous with my foam tape on the back of my watercolor panel. And then I pressed that down onto the prepared card base that I cut and scored earlier before I started all the watercolor painting. So that is the card for today. Lots of watercolor and some gold accents with embossing powder.
Isn't that card so cute? I love how dramatic it is, going from the dark to the lighter purple, or the, well, it's not light purple, to like the more intense purple, and then to like almost like a pink magenta. That color really surprised me, but I love how it turned out. And I really love all that heat embossing on top too. So my question for you guys today is about holiday songs or Christmas carols or songs. What is your favorite Christmas carol or Christmas song? What do you listen to around the holidays? Let me know down below in the comments. I want to know what you're listening to, and if I haven't been listening to it, I'm going to have to add it to my playlist. Thanks so much for watching. I will be back on Monday with day 4 of the holiday card series.